The papers were already signed by the time I poured the coffee. That's the detail I keep coming back to. Not the number on the page, not the lawyer's letterhead, just the fact that I made coffee like it was any other Tuesday, and my father drank his black, the way he always has, while the ink on his signature was still wet 6 inches from his cup. 40%, I said. At the valuation Meyer ran in March. I know it's not what you built it for, Dad, but the market's soft right now, and I don't want to drag this out for either of us. He didn't ask me to justify the number. He didn't ask to see Meyer's assumptions, or the comparable sales, or why I'd picked March instead of the number the accountant ran in January, back before I knew there was a buyer circling. He picked up the pen I'd already set down in front of him, uncapped it, and signed his name the way he signed everything for 40 years. 3 even strokes. No flourish. "If that's what you think is fair, Daniel," he said. And then he smiled. I told myself it was relief. I told myself a 71-year-old man was finally putting his feet up, finally letting his son carry what he'd carried for 3 decades, and that the smile was gratitude wearing a plain face because that's the only face my father's ever had. I believed that for 18 months. I had no reason yet to believe anything else. I should have asked him why he was smiling. I didn't, and that not asking turned out to be the most expensive thing I've ever done. My name is Daniel Pierce. I'm 42 years old, and I live in Cincinnati, about 4 miles from the warehouse my father built with 2 employees and a used forklift in 1988. I ran, and I'll get to why that verb changes. Pierce, Fastening and Supply, an industrial hardware distribution company that does business with contractors and manufacturers across 6 states. I took over as CEO 4 years ago. My father, Walter Pierce, was chairman until the morning I just described, when he stopped being anything to the company at all, at least on paper. I want to walk through exactly how this happened, in the order it happened, because if I only tell you the ending, you'll think I'm a worse man than the story actually requires, or possibly a better one. Neither is accurate. I want you to see the whole shape of it, the way I've had to see it, one piece at a time, over the better part of 2 years. My father is not a complicated man to describe, which is different from saying he's a simple one. He grew up in a house in Norwood where his own father worked a lathe for 31 years and retired with a pension and a bad hip. Walter Pierce did not want that life. But he didn't reject it either. He took the discipline of it and pointed it somewhere else. He sold fasteners out of the back of a Chevy Nova for 2 years before he had enough to lease 800 square feet of warehouse space on Spring Grove Avenue. By the time I was old enough to remember anything, that 800 square feet was 40,000. And he had 11 employees, and a habit that every single one of them could tell you about if you asked. At the bottom of every contract he signed, every one, going back to a supplier agreement I found once in a filing cabinet, dated 1991, he wrote the same 4 words in his own hand, below his printed signature line, "Fair's fair. WP." Not a legal phrase. Not a clause. Just a line he added himself, in blue ink, on every deal he ever put his name to. I asked him about it once when I was maybe 15, filing invoices for summer money, and he said, "A contract tells you what's legal." That line's there to remind me what's right. They're not always the same thing, and a man ought to know which one he's actually agreeing to. My father built the company on a principle he never wrote down anywhere, except in that one recurring line at the bottom of his contracts. But he lived it in 100 smaller ways I only recognize in hindsight as a system, not just a personality. He paid vendors on the day an invoice was due, never early for show, and never late for leverage. He kept the same insurance broker for 26 years, because the man had once eaten a loss on Pierce's behalf during a bad winter in the 90s, and my father considered that debt permanent, in the sense that it never needed repaying, only remembering. He never once, in the entire history of the business, laid off an employee during a slow quarter, without first cutting his own draw to 0. Men who'd worked the floor for him in 1995 were still sending him Christmas cards the year I bought him out, and I used to find that sentimental in a way that mildly embarrassed me. Proof, I told myself, of a man who ran a family operation instead of a real one, who confused loyalty for strategy. I want to be honest about something, because this format only works if I am. I loved my father, and I also spent the last several years of his chairmanship privately convinced he had become a bottleneck. Not incompetent, I never once believed my father was stupid, or lost, or slipping. But slow. Cautious in a way that felt, to a 40-year-old man trying to modernize a distribution business against faster, leaner competitors, like caution for its own sake. He wanted 3 vendor quotes where I wanted 1 good relationship. He wanted to walk the warehouse floor himself before signing off on a new logistics contract, when the data already told us everything we needed to know. There was a specific meeting, maybe 2 years before the buyout, where I'd proposed automating our reorder system with a predictive algorithm that would cut inventory costs by 9%. My father sat through the entire presentation, nodded at the right moments, and then asked one question: what happens the first time it's wrong, and who's standing on the floor when it is? That I privately filed away as the kind of question a man asks when he doesn't fully understand the math, rather than the kind of question a man asks when he understands accountability better than I did. I told myself, and I told my wife Claire more than once, that I wasn't pushing him out because I didn't respect what he'd built. I was pushing him toward the door because I respected it enough to want it to survive contact with an industry that was leaving men like him behind. That was the story I told myself. I believed it sincerely. I want you to understand that sincerity and correctness are not the same thing, because that gap is most of what this story is about. The specific moment arrived because of a man named Russ Okafor, who ran acquisitions for a private equity group called Ashford Meridian. Russ had been sniffing around the regional fastener and industrial supply space for over a year, and in February he took me to lunch at a steakhouse on 4th Street and told me, over a bottle of Cabernet I didn't finish because I was doing math in my head the entire meal, that Ashford Meridian was prepared to make a serious offer for Pierce Fastening and Supply. Serious meaning north of $14 million for the operating company, contingent on what he called clean equity, a single controlling seller, no fractured cap table, no minority shareholder who might slow-walk due diligence or, worse, hold out for more at the closing table. My father owned 40%. I owned 60%. On paper, that shouldn't have mattered. 40% of 14 million is not a small number for anyone. But Russ was clear, in the particular calm way that men who move 8-figure sums are always clear, that Ashford Meridian didn't want to negotiate with 2 Pierces. They wanted 1 signature, 1 seller, 1 man in the room who could make a decision without a family meeting. Simplify it, Russ said, and we move fast. Complicate it, and we walk, or we lowball you for the trouble. I had our accountant, a careful, tired man named Alan Meyer, run a valuation on my father's stake. I told Alan to use the March numbers, a deliberately soft quarter, after we'd lost a large contractor account and before a spring uptick that historically happens every single year, and that I knew, going in, was about to happen again. Alan's valuation came back at just over $1.2 million for 40%. The real number, the number that reflected what Ashford Meridian was actually about to pay, was closer to $5.5 million for that same stake. I knew the gap when I sat down across from my father with the paperwork. I want to say that plainly, because a man who tells this story and pretends he didn't know the math isn't being honest with you, and this whole channel only means anything if I'm honest. I rehearsed the meeting the night before, alone in my study, the way I rehearse most difficult conversations, not the words exactly, but the tone, the pacing, the specific moment where I'd slide the folder across the table before he had time to ask too many questions about the assumptions behind it. I told Claire I was nervous, and she asked me the only question that mattered, which I answered badly. "Does he know about the Ashford offer?" she said, and I told her, "Not the specifics. There's nothing final to tell him yet," which was technically true and which I understood, even as I said it, to be the kind of true that exists mainly to let you sleep. My father arrived at the office that Tuesday morning the way he always had, 20 minutes before anyone else, with his own coffee already made at home because he'd never liked the machine in the break room. He wore a collared shirt, no tie, the same navy jacket he'd worn to every serious meeting of his career, and he sat in the chair on the far side of the small conference table without being asked, because it had been his chair for 30 years before it was ever mine to offer him. I told my father it was a buyout. I told him it was time. I told him, and this part I remember with total clarity, because it's the sentence I'm least proud of in this entire account, that someone has to make the hard call eventually, Dad, and I'd rather it be me than a stranger from private equity. He nodded at that. He didn't argue the number. He asked one question, which at the time I took for a formality and now understand was something else entirely. Is Meyer using this quarter or the year? This quarter, I said. It's the most current data we have. All right, my father said. My sister Meredith was in the room. She handles the books, has for 9 years, ever since she came back from Chicago with her accounting degree and decided Cincinnati suited her better than the Loop did. Meredith didn't say much during the meeting itself, but I saw her jaw work the way it does when she's holding something back, and afterward in the parking lot she caught my arm. You used the March numbers, she said. It wasn't a question. They're accurate. They're technically accurate. That's different. She was looking at me the way she used to look at me when we were kids, and I'd talked her into something she knew was a bad idea but couldn't quite articulate why. Does Dad know about Ashford Meridian? He doesn't need the details of a deal that isn't finalized, I said. That's not deception, Mir. That's just sequencing. He asked which quarter Meyer used, she said, before he signed anything. He asked that specific question, Daniel. That's not the question of a man who isn't paying attention. He's careful. He's always been careful. That's not careful. That's someone checking whether you knew what you were doing to him. She shook her head, the way she does when she's decided arguing further won't change my mind, which was, at that point in my life, usually an accurate read. I hope you're right about this. She didn't push it further after that. She got in her car and drove off, and I told myself her discomfort was Meredith being Meredith. She'd always been the family's conscience, sometimes usefully, sometimes to the point of paralysis, and I'd learned over the years to note her objections and move forward anyway. That's a habit of mine I'm less proud of now than I was then. My father signed the buyout agreement on a Tuesday in April in the small conference room off the warehouse floor where he'd conducted almost every important conversation of his working life. He read the document twice, silently, the way he reads everything, no lawyer of his own in the room. Because I'd told him, truthfully as far as it went, that bringing in outside counsel would slow things down and cost him money out of his own settlement. He signed. He didn't write his 4 words at the bottom this time. I noticed that and didn't think much of it. I told myself the ritual was for deals he was building, not deals where he was stepping back. And then he smiled and said the line about fairness and shook my hand, and that was the entire transaction. 11 minutes, start to finish, for 34 years of a man's life. For a long while after that, nothing happened, which is exactly what I expected and exactly what should have concerned me. The Ashford Meridian deal moved into its next phase almost immediately. Letters of intent. A due diligence team crawling through our financials for 6 weeks. A revised offer that came in even better than Russ's lunch numbers once they saw our actual receivables. I told my father, in general terms, that we had some interest from an investment group. A description so vague it was practically a lie of omission, and he received the news the way he received most business updates by then, with a short nod and a question about whether the warehouse staff would be affected, which I answered honestly, no, not initially, and which seemed to satisfy him completely. I remember feeling a small flicker of relief at how easily he let the subject go, and I understand now that the flicker should have told me something. My father had never in his life let an important subject go easily. He simply let me believe he had. I was, by any reasonable measure, thriving. I made partner-level decisions without having to walk them past anyone. I renegotiated our shipping contracts with 2 logistics firms and cut costs by 11% in a single quarter, a number I would absolutely have brought to my father for a second opinion a year earlier, and didn't now, because there was no one whose opinion I was required to seek. Claire and I put an offer on a house in Hyde Park we'd wanted for 3 years. My son started at a school with a waiting list I'd gotten him off of, in part, I'll admit, because the Pierce name carried more weight in this city than it had a decade earlier. Claire asked me once, early that fall, standing in the kitchen of the new house, with paint samples spread across the counter, whether my father was doing all right. Really all right, not the version I gave at dinner. I told her he seemed content, gardening more, reading more, showing up at the warehouse less. I believed every word of that answer when I gave it. It didn't occur to me, standing in a kitchen I'd bought partly with proceeds from a company he'd built from a used forklift, to wonder whether contentment and quiet were actually the same thing in my father's case, or whether I simply preferred the version that let me sleep. Everything about that year told me I had made the correct, if slightly cold, executive decision. My father, meanwhile, did what my father always does, which is very little that draws attention, and it took me almost a year to understand that very little was doing quite a lot of work. The first thing I noticed, though I didn't register it as anything at the time, was a phone call I overheard maybe 4 months after the buyout, when I stopped by his house on a Sunday to drop off my son for an afternoon and found my father on the back porch, phone to his ear saying, "No, not yet. Let's wait until the Ashford paperwork's further along before we look at the file again." He hung up when he saw me and said it was an old supplier thing. Nothing. And I believed him, because why wouldn't I? My father talked to old suppliers all the time. It didn't occur to me to ask which file. The second thing was smaller still. Meredith mentioned, in passing, over a family dinner that summer, that Dad had gone downtown by himself the previous week for an appointment, and when she'd asked what kind, he'd said, "Just tidying up some old paper. Man my age has a lot of old paper." I remember thinking, mildly, that it was good he was staying organized in retirement, the way people encourage an aging relative to keep busy. I did not think to ask which paper, or why a man who'd handed over his entire equity stake had ongoing appointments about it at all. The third thing I noticed myself, directly, and even at the time it snagged slightly, though not enough to pull the thread. My father still had a relationship with Frank Doss. Frank had been the company's original attorney back in the Spring Grove Avenue days, before we'd brought on a larger corporate firm to handle the more sophisticated work that came with scale, mergers language, employment law, the kind of paperwork Frank, in his 70s himself now, and running a 2-man practice out of a converted house in Clifton, wasn't really built to handle anymore. I'd quietly stopped sending Pierce fastening business to Frank 2 years before the buyout, for entirely reasonable operational reasons. But my father still had lunch with Frank Doss on the second Thursday of every month, a standing appointment that had outlasted the business relationship by years, and I registered it, when I registered it at all, as an old man, keeping an old friend. Nothing more. There was a fourth detail, smaller than the other 3, that I only recovered later when I went looking through my own memory for evidence I'd missed. My father had started, sometime that spring, keeping a battered green ledger on the side table by his reading chair, the same kind of ledger he'd used to track invoices by hand back before the company had real accounting software. A habit I'd assumed he kept purely out of nostalgia. Once, dropping off my son, I'd seen it open on the table and asked, half joking, if he was tracking his golf scores in retirement. "Something like that," he'd said, and closed it, and I'd laughed and thought nothing further of it, because a joke that lands is a very effective way to end a conversation you don't want continued. Those 4 details, the phone call, the downtown appointment, the standing lunch with an attorney I'd stopped using, the green ledger by his chair, sat in my memory like furniture in a room I rarely entered. None of them alarmed me. All of them, I would later understand, were the visible edge of something my father had been quietly managing the entire 18 months I believed the matter was closed. The Ashford Meridian sale reached its final stage in October of the following year, roughly 18 months after my father signed away his stake. The deal had grown, if anything. Ashford's final offer, after due diligence, came in at just under $16 million for the operating company, a number that would have made my father, at his original 40%, a genuinely wealthy man, and made me, frankly, a very wealthy one. I remember sitting in Russ Okafor's downtown office, 3 lawyers on our side and 4 on theirs, ready to walk through what everyone in the room understood to be a formality. Final signatures, wire instructions, champagne afterward if anyone in that industry actually drinks champagne, which in my experience they mostly don't. It was one of Ashford's attorneys, a sharp young woman named Priya Rajan, who stopped the meeting cold. She had a printout in front of her, a property record, a deed, the kind of document that sits in county recorders' offices gathering digital dust until someone runs exactly the right search. The warehouse and the 6 acres it sits on, she said, aren't held by Pierce Fastening and Supply, LLC. They're held by a separate entity, Spring Grove Holdings, which is a trust. The current beneficiary and trustee is listed as Walter R. Pierce. I told her that had to be an error. I told her the operating company owned its own real estate, that it had always owned its own real estate, that I'd walked those floors my whole life and never once seen paperwork suggesting otherwise. Priya slid the printout across the table, and I read it, and I understood, in the space of about 4 seconds, that it was not an error. My father had placed the warehouse and the surrounding land into a personal trust in 1994, 6 years into the company's life, back when Spring Grove Avenue was still a modest operation and the real estate was worth a fraction of what the operating business would eventually be worth. It was, on its face, an entirely ordinary piece of estate planning, the kind any careful small business owner might have done for tax and liability reasons decades before anyone was thinking about private equity buyers. The operating company had always leased the land and building from the trust, at a rate so low and so routine that it had simply become a line item nobody questioned, folded into overhead for 30 years. When I bought out my father's 40% of the operating company, I had bought exactly that, 40% of the operating company. I had never once owned, and had apparently never once thought to check whether I owned, the ground the entire business stood on. The lease between Spring Grove Holdings and Pierce Fastening and Supply. I learned in the following 20 minutes of increasingly quiet conversation had an expiration clause. It was due to lapse in 6 months, and any transfer of the operating company to a new owner, including, specifically, sale to a third party such as Ashford Meridian, required, under the lease's original terms, written consent from the trust, meaning written consent from my father, personally, as trustee. There's a recorded lease agreement dating back to 1994, Priya continued, tapping the printout, between Spring Grove Holdings and the operating company. It's been renewed 9 times, always at the same nominal rate, always for a fixed term. This most recent term expires in April. She looked up at me, and there was no accusation in her face. Only the flat professional curiosity of someone who has found a loose thread and is required, by the nature of her job, to pull it. Mr. Pierce, did you know this trust existed? I said something non-committal, something about needing to check with our corporate counsel, and one of our own attorneys, a younger associate named Beth Okonkwo, who'd been with the firm handling our side of the deal for barely a year, leaned toward me and said quietly, Daniel, if this lease requires trustee consent for a change of control, and the current trustee is your father, we can't close on the current timeline. We may not be able to close at all without his signature. I remember the specific physical sensation of the room's temperature seeming to drop several degrees, though of course nothing about the room had actually changed. Russ Okafor looked at me across the table with an expression I will remember for the rest of my life, somewhere between professional patience and the particular disappointment of a man who has just watched a deal he liked start to wobble. Daniel, he said, does your father know we're in this room right now? I didn't answer him immediately, because I was still doing the math I should have done 18 months earlier. The real math, not the March quarter math. My father had known about Ashford Meridian's interest before I ever sat him down with Meyer's valuation. That was the only way to explain the phone call on the porch, the downtown appointments, the standing lunches with Frank Doss, who I now understood with total certainty had not been managing old paper out of sentiment, but had been quietly reviewing and reaffirming the trust documents governing Spring Grove Holdings for the better part of 2 years, precisely because he could see, long before I brought him a single sheet of paper, that a sale was coming, and that the operating company's equity, on its own, would not be the whole of what changed hands. He had signed the buyout at March's number, knowing it was low, because a fight over Meyer's valuation would have been a fight he could win in an afternoon and would have cost him something else entirely, a confrontation with his son that neither of us would have walked away from cleanly. And he had kept, quietly, without a single word to me. The one piece of leverage that meant no sale of Pierce Fastening and Supply could ever happen without his signature, regardless of what I believed I owned. I called him from the parking garage. I didn't trust myself to have the conversation across a conference table with Ashford's lawyers watching my face. "Dad," I said. "Spring Grove Holdings." There was a pause on the line, not a long one, just long enough for me to hear him set something down. A mug, I think, from the small sound of ceramic on wood. "I wondered how long it'd take," he said. "You've known about Ashford Meridian since before I brought you the buyout papers." "I have. You knew Meyer's number was low. I knew you picked the quarter that made it low. I didn't know if you knew you'd done that, or if you just let Alan pick it and didn't ask why." A pause. "I decided it didn't matter which. Either way, I wasn't going to be the one to make you say it out loud in that room." "Why didn't you fight it? Why didn't you say something? Would you have listened to me argue about a number, Daniel, the same week you were telling me it was time for me to step back?" His voice wasn't sharp. It was, if anything, gentler than I deserved. I'd have been the old man arguing about money. That's a hard thing for a son to hear from a father he's already decided is finished. I didn't need to win that argument. I needed the ground to still be mine when the real conversation came. I sat in that parking garage for 11 minutes after we hung up. I know it was 11 because I looked at the clock on my dashboard before I called, and after, out of some instinct to keep measuring things precisely even as everything I'd measured for the last 2 years came apart in my hands. I want to be exact about what I felt, because this is not a story where I'm going to tell you I broke down. I didn't. What I felt was closer to the sensation of a floor you've walked across 1,000 times turning out, on the 1,001st, to have been a different material the entire time, not collapsing under you, just revealing itself as something other than what you'd assumed. I drove home instead of back to the office that afternoon, which I almost never do in the middle of a business day, and I sat in the driveway for a while before going inside, running the 18 months backward in my head like a tape, trying to find the exact point where I could have asked a different question and gotten a truer answer. There wasn't one single point. That was the hardest part to accept, that it wasn't one missed conversation, but 18 months of small, comfortable inattentions, each one reasonable on its own, that had added up to a father and son operating on 2 entirely different sets of facts without either of us ever naming it out loud. The first thing I had to sit with, in the days after, was the plainest one. I had misjudged my father completely. Not sentimentally, not in the sense of failing to appreciate him, though there was plenty of that too, but factually, as a matter of competence. I had built an entire strategy, an entire justification for how I treated him, on the premise that he was a step behind the business, a man whose caution was really just diminishment wearing a dignified face. The truth was that my father had been 2 full steps ahead of me for the entire 18 months I believed I'd settled the matter. He had understood the shape of the Ashford Meridian deal before I'd finished my stake with Russ Okafor. He had understood exactly what my buyout offer was worth, to the dollar, and had signed it anyway, and had done so while quietly protecting the one asset that meant his signature would matter again when it counted. That is not the profile of a man who had slowed down. That is the profile of a man who had simply stopped explaining himself to a son who'd already decided he didn't need to. The second realization took longer to arrive, and it mattered more. It would have been easy, almost comfortable, in a strange way, if my father's restraint had simply been strategy, a chess move. The quiet satisfaction of a man setting a trap and waiting 18 months to spring it. That story would have let me be angry, and anger is a much easier thing to carry than what I actually had to carry, which was the understanding that my father had not been building towards some vindicating confrontation at all. If he had wanted to punish me, he had every tool to do it the day I sat him down with Meyer's number. He could have called Ashford Meridian himself. He could have hired his own counsel and dragged the buyout into a dispute that would have cost me the sale, and possibly the company. He did none of that. He simply held the ground, literally, the actual ground under the warehouse, so that no version of the future could be decided entirely without him, and then he waited, without a word of warning, without a hint of grievance, for the moment when the truth would surface on its own, because he knew it eventually would. That is not the behavior of a man protecting his pride. That is the behavior of a man protecting his son from becoming, permanently and irreversibly, the kind of man who sells his own father's life's work at a discount and never has to answer for it. My father had given me 18 months to become someone I might have to live with. He hadn't done it out of weakness. He'd done it, I came to understand, out of something closer to love than I had any framework for at the time, a love that didn't need to announce itself and didn't need my gratitude to be complete. I drove to his house 2 days after the Ashford meeting, without calling first, which is not something either of us usually does. He was in the garage, of all places, sanding down an old workbench he'd had since Spring Grove Avenue. Sawdust on his forearms, radio playing low. He didn't stop sanding when I came in. "I know about the trust," I said. "I know you've known about Ashford Meridian since before I brought you the buyout." "I figured you'd get there," he said. "You could have told me. Any point in the last 18 months you could have told me, and saved us both from—" I stopped, because I didn't have a clean end to that sentence. He set the sandpaper down, finally, and looked at me directly, the way he used to look at me across that same conference room table when I was a teenager, who thought he understood something his father didn't. "I didn't sign that paper because I believed your number, Daniel," he said. "I signed it because I wasn't ready to make you become someone you'd have to spend the rest of your life regretting being. You needed to get there yourself. I couldn't hand you that." I asked him, because I needed to hear it plainly, whether he'd been angry. He thought about it, actually thought, the way he thinks before he signs anything, and said, "Some, not at you exactly. At the version of you that thought fair was a number you could pick a quarter for. Then, after a beat, you're not that version anymore. That's the only part that ever mattered to me." "How did you know I wasn't that version anymore?" "I only found out about the trust 3 days ago." "I didn't know," he said. "I was waiting to see which way you'd go once you did find out. Some men would have come in here with their own lawyer, looking to argue the lease terms down. You came in here asking me why I didn't tell you sooner. That's the answer, right there. I didn't need you to apologize, Daniel. I needed to see what you'd ask first." I didn't have anything to say to that for a moment, and my father, who has never in his life felt obligated to fill a silence just because one of us was uncomfortable in it, let it sit until I was ready. That was the entire conversation. No raised voices. No accusation dressed up as forgiveness. Just a man sanding a workbench, telling his son the truth in as few words as he's ever needed for anything important, and going back to the sanding when he was done. Because he'd said what needed saying and saw no reason to say it twice. I didn't try to fix what I'd done with an apology, because I understood, standing in that garage, that an apology would have been the cheapest thing I could offer him and the thing he'd have had the least use for. My father has never once, in 42 years, asked me to feel bad on his behalf. What he has, on the rare occasions he's asked me for anything, asked for is that I do the actual work of correcting a thing rather than simply narrating my regret about it. So I did the work. I went back to Alan Meyer and had him rerun the original valuation using the annual figures instead of the single soft quarter, and then I had him rerun it a second time incorporating the Ashford Meridian offer itself, since that offer existed in truth, before my father ever signed anything. The difference came to just over $4.3 million. I wired it to him myself, from my own share of the eventual sale proceeds, not the company's account, because I wanted it to come from something that was actually mine to give rather than a line item I could file under corporate housekeeping. I told him what it was for when I called to confirm the transfer, and he said only, "That's fair." And I understood, hearing him say that specific word back to me, that he was telling me something about the difference between a number that's technically accurate and a number that's actually right. I also called Meredith before I did any of it, which I hadn't done with the original buyout, and asked her to review every number herself before it went anywhere near my father's signature. She read through Meyer's revised figures for the better part of an afternoon, asked me 4 separate times whether I'd use the annual data or let anyone pick a convenient quarter, and when she was finally satisfied, she said only, "This is the number I would have run you in the first place, if you'd asked me instead of Alan." I told her she was right, because she was, and because I'd learned by then that the version of me who used to route around inconvenient opinions wasn't a version I wanted to keep being. I renegotiated the Spring Grove Holdings lease with him directly, not through Ashford's lawyers, not through my own corporate counsel, but sitting across the same conference table where I'd once handed him a buyout with a number I'd chosen for its softness. This time the terms were his to set, and he set them plainly, a long-term lease that protected the trust's value regardless of who eventually owned the operating company, and a single line, added at his request, granting him permanent, unrestricted access to walk the warehouse floor for as long as he wanted to, whenever he wanted to, no appointment required. I signed it without a single objection, and for the first time in 2 years I meant every word of my own signature. I also asked him to come back, not to the chairmanship, which he didn't want, and which I understood, by then not to offer as a consolation prize, but as a formal advisor to the transition team overseeing the Ashford Meridian handover, with his name and title on the letterhead going out to every vendor, every employee, every longtime supplier who'd built relationships with him over 3 decades. It wasn't restoring him to power. It was making sure the record, going forward, said plainly what had always been true and what I had spent 2 years quietly trying to right around, that Pierce Fastening and Supply was his before it was ever mine, and that nothing about the sale changed the order of that sentence. He accepted all of it with the same measured nod he'd given the original buyout papers, which is to say without ceremony, without a speech, without letting the moment become bigger than it needed to be. He didn't tell me he forgave me. I didn't ask him to. What he did, a few weeks later, on the day the Ashford Meridian deal finally closed, was take the pen I'd handed him for the final round of transition paperwork, sign his name in 3 even strokes the way he always has, and then, for the first time since the original buyout, write 4 familiar words underneath it in blue ink. Bears Fair, W.P. I don't think I've fully worked out, even now, what it costs a man to assume someone has less left in him than they actually have. I know what it cost me, 18 months of believing I'd settled something that was never mine to settle alone. A number on a page that took $4.3 million and a great deal of quiet to correct, and a version of myself I'm not eager to describe to my own son when he's old enough to ask what kind of businessman his father used to be. My father never told me any of this while it was happening. He let me find it, the way he lets most things find their own pace, because he understood something I didn't yet, that pride doesn't announce when it's about to cost you everything. And the men who diminish the people who raised them rarely do it loudly enough to notice in the moment. It happens in a quarter you picked on purpose. It happens in a smile you don't ask about. My father is 73 now. He still walks the warehouse floor most mornings, no appointment required, and he still writes those 4 words under anything he signs. I understand them differently than I did. I don't think I'll ever stop understanding them a little more, the longer I sit with what they actually cost him to mean. If this one sat with you the way it sat with me, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more measured, honest stories.